Well, the time is just gone 17 minutes past 9, and this hour of news and views is sponsored by Africa Muslims Agency. Africa Muslims Agency, a beacon of hope to communities for over 35 years in Africa and beyond. Now, still to come on the show, we are going to be focusing on freedom fighter Leila Khalid, deserving a street name. And this is according to an activist and author and teacher, Zed Khan. And also later on, we will be focusing on Heritage Day, the National Mosque Open Day with Sheikh Mohammed Yusuf Khan from the Uwais Karni Islamic Center. Among some of the other issues we still have got fired up with Hafiz Imran Chunara, Personal Excellence Mentor and CEO of Africa Muslims Agency. So a fair amount to come on this beautiful day of Jumu'ah and from now right until 10 a.m. Next up, activists also and teachers at Khan, and this about the renaming of Senton Drive to Leila Khalid Drive. Obviously, this has sparked controversy, especially among those who are vehemently opposed to it. And this is the reason why we are joined by the author and teacher and activist at Khan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome and jazakallah khairan so much for your time with us this morning.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Mr. Wadi. Thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. I apologize if you can hear any background school-related noises because I am at school this morning.
No problem. We'll call you Miss Khan since you've called me Mr. Wadi. So we'll keep it at that. Well, let's talk about obviously this controversy. And we know it has been a controversial issue for a very, very long time. And just Leila Khalid, and my question would be to you is why do you think the mere mention of Leila Khalid's name provokes such a strong reaction, especially when we see groups like the DA and the Patriotic Alliance?
Oh, I love this question. It's because she's a female Palestinian freedom fighter and not just any. She's like one of the coolest. I think I would love to have an opportunity on your show at some point to tell you like one of my favorite things about her. But let me get into the question. Interestingly enough, the deputy president and the president of the Patriotic Alliance, which is Kenny Kunene and Gaten McKenzie, interestingly enough, they actually just returned from a trip to Israel where they met with President Herzog and they were talking about fostering better relationships between the two countries. They also spoke about how Israel and South Africa can learn from each other. So I don't think it's any surprise when you look at this relationship and you look at this trip that they took recently. I don't think it's any surprise to be able to trace back where this opposition for the renaming of Leila Khalid Drive is actually coming from. So they're framing it as a waste of funds and unnecessary expenditure, but obviously they're not going to come out directly and say, well, we don't want to rename Santon Drive to Leila Khalid Drive because she's a Palestinian freedom fighter, obviously. But I think the underlying intention is very, very clear. So yeah, I think that's very clear. I don't think we need any stretch of the imagination to see the link between their trip to Israel and now coming back to South Africa and looking at this issue and then opposing the renaming because obviously it's not going to work for their friends back in Israel if they support such a motion.
Well, I recall interviewing Kenny Kunene after this trip, and I must say that, obviously he got a lesson on Palestine because it is clear that sometimes, they undertake these trips, but they still don't know what they are talking about. And we've seen even with Gaten McKenzie spewing venom against the people of Palestine, and we see it throughout the election campaign, and he continues doing that. So again, they've got this whole freedom fighter versus terrorist narrative, and this is one of the reasons why opponents of the renaming have gone so far as labeling Leila Khalid as a terrorist. They've ignored her legacy as a Palestinian freedom fighter. The key issue here is how do we counter the narrative that attempts to whitewash history and paint all resisted movements as acts of terror, especially when we know that even our very own Nelson Mandela faced similar labels.
Look, again, it's about who's telling the stories. And we need to be able to change this narrative. Western media is never going to acknowledge the contributions of people like Leila Khalid. When you read anything about her, the first things that you learn about her is that she was one of the first female hijackers. And so people ignore her legacy and they look at the activities or they look at incidents around her activism, but they don't understand the full context. They don't examine the full context. And you mentioned Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela remained on U.S. terror watch list until 2008. And interestingly enough, Mandela actually said that the armed struggle was forced on us by the government. So when you're looking at this label of terrorism and you look at it without examining the context, it's really interesting when you go back to South Africa's own history and you look at the ANC, which since its founding in 1912, used primarily non-violent means to protest against the apartheid government, like labor strikes and public service boycotts. And when those were ineffective, I think the turning point came for us in 1960 during the Sharpeville massacre, where 69 protesters were killed and 180 were wounded. And at this point, it became necessary for violence and aggression to become used as tools against the conflict. And when Mandela became the head of the military wing Umkhonto we Sizwe, he was regarded as a terrorist. And according to an article in Time magazine, they described the group's activities from 1962 as low-level guerrilla warfare. Look, at the end of the day, when you look at resistance fighting, it's not palatable. It's not palatable. We can't sanitize it. But then, is occupation palatable? Is injustice palatable? So I think when you conflate resistance with terrorism, it's a very deliberate conflation, and it ignores the true context behind why certain actions were undertaken. And it can never be sanitized. I mean, hijacking a plane, or, there was also a bombing at a military base in South Africa in 1993, which killed people. Unfortunately, it's collateral damage in that regard. You can't sanitize it. If you look at countries like Israel, there's every justification thrown out that they're defending themselves and they're defending their country when they're openly committing war crimes. And yet, why aren't they being labeled as a terrorist state by their allies? So it's interesting.
Well, you have obviously partly answered my next question, where we were going to
Sorry.
talk about the historical. I said you've partly answered my next question, which is drawing historical parallels, looking at South Africa, our history of resistance against apartheid, but also at the same time, there were times when it was necessary to use violence to overthrow an oppressive regime. And in today's time, there is no other regime that is more oppressive than the Zionist state of Israel. And again, the key question here is, why do you think there's a disconnect when it comes to recognizing similar resistance efforts like that of Leila Khalid, especially when we look at it as South Africans, we think of apartheid in the context of Israel and Palestine?
Look, I think again, it's about the perspective. It's about who's telling the narrative and their particular, their particular views and their particular allegiances. So again, it's not in the interest of the Zionists to support Leila Khalid's actions because it's a threat to their ideology and wanted to destroy it. And the same can be said about the reactions of the world to the resistance action taken by Hamas on October 7th, because still many news outlets refuse to acknowledge that this act of resistance was as a direct response to the decades of oppressive Zionist apartheid education. When you link it to South Africa and you wonder now, why is there this disconnect where the actions of Hamas is so opposed, but the very same people would now be, or would have, supported the end of apartheid, and they do not support racism or oppression, and they support democracy and all these Western liberal ideals. And then you ask yourself again, where does the disconnect come from? And the disconnect is not from ignorance. The disconnect is from taking sides. It comes from taking sides. And it becomes confusing, I think, when both sides think that their actions are justified. And so people deliberately ignore the fact that, for example, Hamas is a democratically elected government. So it comes down to a matter of choice. People have chosen to ignore the truth and bury their heads in the sand. And that's the way they want to continue because it's a side that they've taken, unfortunately.
Yes. And also, I think what is important to understand is we see this deep rooted hypocrisy in South Africa from certain areas, and particularly from the opposition. And we know that many of them oppose the renaming of Center Drive to honor Leila Khalid. They claim it is due to financial or bureaucratic reasons. But we know the real reason is rooted in her role as a Palestinian revolutionary. And again, in terms of our response, and my question to you, Ms. Khan, how would you respond to the hypocrisy of those who don't see the same commitment to the liberation that shaped even our very own history here in South Africa?
Well, I would say to them, why are you bluffing? It means that you don't truly believe in these ideals, because you cannot selectively believe in, you cannot selectively believe in ideals or values like democracy and freedom when it just applies to one group of people. You cannot selectively choose to support and advocate for democracy for a specific group of people and then the same breath advocate for the exact opposite for another group of people. I think in South Africa, though, although we share very, very much similar histories in terms of our apartheid context, the situation in Palestine is slightly different because I think that what's happening in Israel is where Israel's conflating the conflict with religion, even though we know that Zionism is a secular construct and has nothing to do with the core principles of Judaism. So there's always a hidden agenda here. Those who are objecting to this renaming are the same people who are the advocates for the Zionist occupation regime in Palestine. So there's a clear link there. So, how can we then say that these people, these politicians who talk about freedom and democracy and equality, their words are just empty? And so they're bluffing nobody, because at the end of the day, the world is watching, and we're watching very carefully. We can see which people have actually used even the issue and the conflict in Palestine to further their own political ambition and agenda. And those same politicians are very quiet now. And then we can also see the same people who promise us that they're going to fight for the people and then ignore the fact that the very, very same ideology which, existed in South Africa is taking place in another part of the world, and then it's not relevant anymore. So there's a disconnect again here.
Yes, what we're going to do, Ms. Khan, is I'm going to go for a quick ad break. There's just a few more issues that I think we need to raise. This is a very, very important, but a very, very interesting discussion as well. So we're going to put you on hold and we'll be back.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda. Sponsor.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
For the first time, I can dream again.
The Africa Muslims Agency Orphan Hope Program provides the food, clothing, and basic support needed by thousands of children across the world. Every child deserves a chance at a hopeful future.
For 50,000 rands, you can transform our lives with the AMA Orphan Hope Program.
Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
Dad, these Frymax chips are so tasty.
Wow, that really takes me back. My dad bought me a Frymax chips every day after school. They were my favorite when I was your age as well. Quality is at the very heart of what we do. And that's why we ensure that every Frymax packet is filled with the beautiful goodness and flavor-packed taste that you've come to expect from us since 1982. Frymax, from generation to generation.
Connect and stay ahead with Salam Media. This is Salam Media, coming to you live from South Africa.
We continue our discussion this morning, and I must say, an extremely important but very, very interesting discussion with Miss Z Khan. And we are talking about the renaming of Senton Drive to Leila Khalid Drive. Obviously, this has created controversy, but just to put this entire discussion into context and why it is so necessary. And I must say that a number of issues that we still need to discuss and to understand why this is important, looking at South Africa, looking at our position on Palestine, the importance of symbolism, and again, looking at someone like Leila Khalid, a female revolutionary in a revolutionary in almost every right. And again, this whole question about the resistance, but also what do we as South Africans actively and practically, how can we continue creating awareness for this initiative to take place? Ms. Khan, let us continue and looking at South Africa. South Africa has been at the forefront in their support for the people of Palestine, the ICJ case, but for a very, very long time, South Africa has enjoyed this strong bond, this association with Palestine, with the people of Palestine. Nelson Mandela, in particular, we know of his relationship even with the late Yasser Arafat. And again, everybody quotes his famous saying, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. And again, it's not only about Leila Khalid, but it's also about honoring Nelson Mandela's legacy and our commitment to the global struggle against oppression, especially when critics ignore this connection.
Yeah, when asked about his relationship with the Palestine Liberation Organization during a town hall meeting in the United States, Mandela reiterated his support for the PLO, who were then actually still regarded as a terrorist organization by the United States. And just to give your listeners an idea of how close the bond is between Palestine and South Africa, in 2016, Palestinians unveiled a giant statue of him in the West Bank city of Ramallah. And as you mentioned, in his 1997 speech on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, he reaffirmed his support for Palestinian rights, and he called Yasser Arafat his comrade in arms. So, yeah, Nelson Mandela has always consistently reaffirmed support for Palestine because of the parallels that South Africa and Palestine share in the struggle for freedom. And it turns out that in 1993, he expressed, and the ANC expressed their unhappiness with Israel's collaboration with our apartheid government. So, when we look at Israel, it's not just that Mandela supported Palestine's right for freedom, but Israel was actively involved and collaborated with our apartheid government. In fact, we have not forgotten that many of the weapons that the apartheid government used to kill our people were actually bought from Israel. And it has since emerged that Israel went so far as to offer nuclear warheads to the apartheid regime. So we cannot ignore that our histories share similar parallels. And in order to honor Madiba's legacy, we cannot fight for the liberation of one people while simultaneously ignoring the oppression of the other. So you cannot say, I'm going to celebrate Mandela Day and, Mandela is this icon. We cannot revere him if we ignore the basic principles and values for which he sacrificed his life.
Well, we saw that celebration. We saw that acknowledgement when South Africa took the case to the ICJ in Ramallah, the South African flag flying alongside the Palestinian flag at the statue of Nelson Mandela. So, we've seen how Palestinians appreciate. And I must say, over and over again, whenever I talk to people from Palestine, their gratitude, their appreciation to the people of South Africa is invaluable. And we hear it over and over again. And this is why we need to honor them here in our country. And this brings me to my next question about the importance of symbolism. What role do symbols such as street names play in keeping up the struggle for the people of Palestine, the liberation of Palestine alive in South Africa? and also honoring figures like Leila Khalid to help us to solidify international solidarity?
Her name alive means keeping her legacy alive. And just the publicity around the naming debacle has sparked interest and conversations around who Leila Khalid is and what she fought for. So we need to keep these conversations alive so that the current and future generations understand the commitment and dedication of people such as Leila Khalid and the commitment that they had in fighting for a cause that they believed in for the betterment of humanity. And I think when you use the word global struggle, when you fight against evil and oppression that seek to destroy the liberation and freedom of people and their right to exist and their right to remain in their own land, you have to understand that it's something that is a global, it's a struggle that impacts all of us. So we can't look at what is happening in Palestine and say that the fight for the freedom of Palestine is limited to the Arab countries. It's not our responsibility, or it's the sole responsibility of the Palestinians. It's a global fight between the forces of good and the forces of darkness. And to paraphrase Benjamin Netanyahu's speech that he gave at the U.S. Congress earlier this year, it's a clash between civilizations and barbarism. That's what it really, really is. We cannot do this alone. And by having Leila Khalid's name on that drive, firstly, I hope that when Kenny Kunene and Dayton McKenzie drive down Stanton Drive, which will be Leila Khalid Drive, that they will be reminded of the legacy of this incredible female revolutionary. We have to learn and be inspired by each other. South Africa did not defeat apartheid alone. We had the help of so many countries across the world. And so we need to be able to repay that debt, and we need to be able to honor people who share our ideals and our values and understand that we are in this fight. It's a global fight and we need to be in it together.
Well, we certainly need to be, and heading 1 year towards into this genocide that is unfolding in Gaza as well, and often, we find the female genders being criticized. We see strong female revolutionaries like Leila Khalid being criticized more harshly than the male counterparts. But at the end of the day, even when one looks at Gaza right now, even when one looks at Palestine, the struggle in Palestine in general as well, Al-Aqsa in itself, where the first line of defense normally we find is women are at the forefront as well. And again, this is the reason why I say is one cannot isolate and criticize people based on gender. And just looking at somebody like Leila Khalid as well, do you think her gender role plays a role in how detractors perceive her actions and her legacy? And how important is it to celebrate women like her and the thousands and thousands of other Palestinian women in our struggle for justice?
Okay, so firstly, Leila Khalid destroyed. She completely obliterated the stereotypes of women in society at that time. And obviously, she's a woman. She was objectified in the media. She was actually sexualized in the media. I read a bit about it. I don't think I'll be able to say more about it on air. But yeah, she was objectified in the media. But regarding her own personal views, she was not interested in feminism, as much as she was interested in freeing Palestine. And she never spoke about women, only the revolution. And when asked about gender, she said that she came to realize that she didn't need to prove herself of being worthy of doing the things that men could do. And she's such an inspiration to all women, especially now when we're seeing women taking up positions of power, positions of leadership, and they're being so much more involved. And they're being given the respect that they deserve. And so I think this revival of Leila Khalid as a feminist revolutionary icon is just at the perfect time in terms of, this political correctness that we have and all the talk around gender stereotypes. I don't actually believe that her gender currently would do would detract from her legacy. I think if anything now, it will enhance her legacy because she served as a real inspiration, even for women such as myself. So, during an interview with the Guardian, she said that she represents Palestinians and not women. And I think this is really, really important. During the time, men were frustrated with her because she got a lot of attention because she was doing things that, were typically done by men at that time in terms of her activism. And women were frustrated because she never spoke about women. And she made it really, really clear that this is not about feminism. She didn't go out there and go, well, I'm going to join this cause and I'm going to fight for this cause because I want to, change the status quo around women. It was about, I'm Palestinian. Whether I'm a woman or not, I'm a Palestinian and I'm fighting for this cause. So when it comes to fighting for justice, what we learned from Leila Khaled is that it is something that we need to all be invested in, regardless of our gender, because ultimately it affects all of us. So when we look at what is happening in Palestine, and you look at how the Palestinian women are at the forefront of everything that's happening, and they, often bear the brunt of I think they bear a much greater burden than the men. They've got their families to look after. They've got their children to look after as well. Food, looking after the home. Often the homes are destroyed. And so these are the real soldiers and the heroines of our times. And we really need to look at Palestinian women as being true, inspirational, feminist.
Well, certainly, in fact, what you are saying is very, very true because irrespective of who you are and what your background, uh, considering what is taking place in Palestine, what has been happening for many, many times, for many years, for decades, it's about you have the right to resist. And
Yeah.
this, sometimes when one looks at the detractors, you'll find this disconnect when it comes to understanding the right to resist, particularly in occupied lands like Palestine. And again,
Mhm.
we need to continue remind people of this, that resistance in all its forms is a legitimate response to occupation, and that labeling it as terrorism only benefits the oppressors.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I will use Leila Khaled's words. When asked if she regarded herself as a terrorist, she said, "Who planted terrorism in our area?" She said, "Some came and took our land, forced us to leave and forced us to live in camps. I think this is terrorism. Resisting this terrorism is called struggle." So when people label resistance as terrorism, it's the first step that any oppressor is going to take in countering any form of resistance. It's like a protective cover that provides justification for any retaliation that the oppressor wishes to take. And I'm not advocating for violence here, but I fail to see how a violent occupation can be overthrown and dismantled via pacifist means. And so Leila was very unapologetic with regards to that point, and it made her a bit of a divisive figure because she advocated for using aggressive means to be able to end the conflict. And so, pacifism is actually a weakness that is exploited by such regimes. And Leila understood that you've got to fight fire with fire. I mean, if you look at what's happened in Palestine for the past 75 years, marches and boycotts and all of these things, it has had no effect. It has had very little impact. And so when Hamas decided, or when they took the decision to, carry out the October 7 resistance action, the world just jumped on it as terrorism, failing to understand that there was a whole 75-year history of occupation and oppression that was behind it. But now if you look at on the other side of the coin, when you look at Israel's actions in Gaza, it's completely justified. It's not seen as terrorism because they are defending their own land. But if you really look at it, that's exactly what Hamas is doing. They're defending their land, they're defending their people. And so we need to be able to look objectively, and we need to be able to see, change our perspectives on certain things. And I think that role is up to the media, really, because the way that the narrative is told or the way that it's shapes perspectives and ultimately shapes the outcomes of these things. So when you look at it, in Leila's own words, who are the real terrorists? Is it the one who has been displaced from her land? She was displaced from Haifa in 1948, and she had to move to Lebanon as a refugee. From the time she was a toddler, she has been a victim of this conflict. How do you expect her then to sit back and just be fine with it? I think one of my favorite anecdotes about Leila is that when she hijacked one of the planes, I think it was in 1969, she forced the pilot to fly over Haifa because she wanted to see the town that she was not permitted to visit. And I think that's one of the coolest, things I've ever read about anybody. The imagery is just, I just want to imagine what that moment must have been like for her and for the pilot, actually.
Wow! In fact, obviously,
Know that. Can I tell you something
really,
else?
I'm actually blown away by what you've just said, Ms. Khan. Really, I think it's just so important. And again, you talk about the narrative and you talk about the mainstream. You speak about corporate global media as well. And in our recent tour that we had with Yumna Al Said as well, this featured very, very strongly. And this is the reason why we need to continue as media talking about it, but more importantly, to prompt people, to drive people into a call of action. And we know South Africa has been doing a lot, but I'm sure we can do a lot more as South African citizens, actively, practically creating awareness. And also, just finally, for those who are listening, who may still be on the fence about the renaming of Senton Drive, what would you say to convince them that honoring Leila Khalid is not just about a name on a street, but it has got a lot more. It has got a deeper meaning to stand out against oppression, and again to remind us as South Africans of our own revolutionary spirit.
Get off the fence. Get off the fence. It's a simple thing. At the end of the day, having her name, firstly, Santon is derived from Sandown and Bryanston. So there's no significance behind the name Santon. So it doesn't matter if it's there or not there. But when you look at someone like Leila Khaled, having her name up there on such an important street in Johannesburg is a reminder, firstly, of her legacy. It is an ode to her. It's something honoring her. It shows solidarity. It reaffirms this amazing relationship that Palestine and South Africa has and will continue to have, because we are comrades in arms. And so I think it's something that is really, really important, because, again, it reaffirms the idea that solidarity is a global, the fight against oppression and freedom fighting is a global fight. And we need to be able to learn from each other. We need to be inspired by each other. So having her name there I think it's where it belongs.
Well, Ms. Khan, I must say it's been an absolute pleasure, and I know I engaged you longer than what we normally do, but really it's been a fascinating discussion, and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on with us this morning right here on Assalam Media. We wish you all the best, and please take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ms. Khan, activist, author, and teacher with us this morning against the renaming of Senton Drive to Leila Khalid Drive, and unpacking just a whole host of issues. And I must say, once again, a fascinating discussion with my guest this morning. We're going to go for a break. We'll be back.